of a refugee crisis, sluggish economic growth, and a growing disillusionment with the European Union. What you get are far-right parties, which are some long-standing and others newly formed to achieve electoral success in a number of European nations. In this edition of the debate, we'll look at some of these parties and why they're gaining such traction with the masses, and whether this will have a staying power or not, along with the threat that this poses the European Union.
And other people I've met.
Just months after Brexit in the UK and the victory of Donald Trump in the US, European leaders are warning about a far-right surge in the continent. Their fears are not without merit. Polls are pointing to a sweeping nationalist tide across Europe. Some analysts blame the failed policies of certain European capitals for the rising insecurity across Europe, which in turn has caused hardships for their own people.
The EU is also synonymous with NATO. I think 90% of the countries in the European Union are also members of NATO. And NATO is complicit in all these US-driven foreign wars. And so the immigrants coming to Europe that are helping the rise of these far-right parties are actually caused by NATO partly and the policies and dictates of the United States.
Europe wasn't spared of terror in 2016. Last year alone, several high-profile attacks struck major European cities, including Paris and Berlin. Many have blamed the interventionist and hypocritical policies of the US and its European allies for the attacks. Germany, France, the UK and the US have all provided support to militants in the Middle East and North Africa, who are blamed for the insecurity that brought about the displacement of millions of people, forcing them to leave their countries to Europe. European leaders haven't overlooked the rising far-right tendencies at home. In his annual New Year's address, France's President François Hollande warned that democracy, freedom and social rights are under threat. He took a swipe at both the US and the UK, which have seen a swing to the right.
Democracy, freedom, social rights, Europe and even peace, all of that becomes vulnerable and even reversible. We saw it in the United Kingdom with Brexit, and in the United States during the election in November. We see it across our continent with the rise of extremism. In history, there are moments where everything can change dramatically. We are living through one.
Hollande's comments come less than 5 months before presidential elections in France. Experts are pointing to a surge by far-right nationalist candidates, such as National Front leader Marine Le Pen, who has advocated a tough stance on immigration. She has also campaigned on an anti-EU and anti-Eurozone platform. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has issued a similar warning. She is facing key elections in 2017. Her centre-right Christian Democratic Union of Germany party has been on the defensive, suffering defeats in local elections. Many are blaming Berlin's aggressive policies vis-à-vis Syria for causing human suffering and displacement of civilians.
Yes, Europe is slow, it's arduous, it has to accept deep incisions like the exit of a member state. And yes, Europe should focus on what can really be better than the national state. But no, we Germans should never be led to believe that each could have a better future by going it alone.
With the upcoming elections in the Netherlands drawing closer, European leaders are scrambling to contain a rising nationalist wave they have created. Dutch anti-Islam and anti-EU candidate Geert Wilders is also expected to fare well in the March elections. Elections are also due in Greece and Denmark, where far-right parties are expected to be boosted by both Trump's victory and Brexit. With growing austerity measures across Europe and no end in sight to the refugee crisis, the risks to Europe in 2017 remain very high, and European leaders have no one to blame other than themselves.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, senior analyst at Foreign Policy and Focus, Ian Williams, joins us from New York. And we have Director of the Burgess Group, Robert Oulds, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. Ian Williams, I'll start with you. It seems like the year 2017, by many accounts, has been deducted to be a year where far-right parties are poised to win in the European elections. Define for us, if you can, what a far-right party is and why so many are saying that they are going to win many of the elections that are going to be held in Europe.
Well, I'm not quite sure the old labels really work anymore when we say far right. I mean, if you think in Britain, UKIP and the Brexit Party campaigned on a programme of diverting money from the European Union to the British National Health Service. Now, we know they were lying through their teeth because they want to dismantle the British National Health Service now that these people are in power. In Britain, in the US, you had Donald Trump campaigning against the plutocrats and Goldman Sachs, against a so-called left-winger who was in bed with Goldman Sachs, but actually supported gay and minority rights, which made her left and him right. It's very difficult to work out these labels. I think we're going to have to scrutinize it. But insofar as the ideology, even the conservatives in Europe, like the Christian Democrats, in the past supported a collectivist approach to health service, to pensions, to looking after the disabled in the society. And what's happened over the last 20 years, 30 years since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, is that even both left and right have united in deciding the problem with poor people is not poverty, it's because there are too many poor people who won't work. This is the essence of the neoliberal exercise. So they've been blaming the victims, and the victims are now revolting. And they're not necessarily voting very accurate, very, how should we say, strategically. Voting for Donald Trump when he invades against Goldman Sachs and then watching him appoint half of Goldman Sachs to his cabinet should give everybody a pause for thought. And across Europe, the idea that you support the European Union, which was very much a level playing field in time to watch the European Union squash Greece and poor people and normal middle-class people in Greece into the ground and grind their nose in the dust in the name of a frequently disproved economic theory. This gives everybody a pause, and nothing is fixed anymore. To quote the Communist Manifesto, nothing is fixed, nothing is sacred. Everything is up for grabs. Okay. And the fact that people who actually support increased welfare payments also dislike immigrants, does that make them left or right? It's very difficult, and I think we've got to rethink the political vocabulary.
Robert Oulds, go ahead.
Well, since the referendum on Britain leaving the European Union, Britain has actually gone more to the left. We've had Jeremy Corbyn, the far-left leader of the Labour Party, become entrenched. Actually, in a recent leadership election, he actually received more support, and the Labour Party is now the biggest political party in Western Europe. Of course, it's actually very low in the opinion polls, but his position and his policies in Labour are actually very entrenched now. And there's a change in leadership of the Conservative Party and a move away from the austerity programme that was previously conducted under David Cameron and George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course David Cameron, the Prime Minister, and abandoned the austerity programme. Of course, they didn't really have a choice because the targets in budget reductions were actually going to be missed. But actually, there's a lot of talk coming from Theresa May setting out a social justice agenda, which is actually her background in terms of politics. She's actually, in terms of being a conservative, rather a left-wing conservative. So really, Britain has actually moved to the left. Whether that it's not a substantive move, not a big move in terms of sort of major policy changes, but it hasn't been a sort of right-wing trend happening since the referendum. Indeed, the referendum was simply about Britain retaking control of its own affairs and leaving what is in reality a European Union that works for those who can access it, those who can access its corridors of power, big corporations, financial institutions, and its policies actually created mass poverty and unemployment in large parts of Europe, France, and of course especially southern Europe, all in the name of its political project, and of course representing those who really have access to the European Union, which is those who have access to money and power, not ordinary people. So retaking control of our own democracy is not a move to the right. In fact, the reverse has happened in a small way, granted, but the reverse has happened. It's about being a democratic, self-governing country. It's as simple as that. That's not actually a move to the right. In other countries, people are going to the extremes. We saw Syriza being elected in Greece. Of course, they then abandoned their ideology in favour of staying within the euro and the EU single currency, because they really didn't have a choice, because they were bullied, or they weren't prepared to make the choice of Greece leaving the euro. In other countries, there is other extremist parties emerging, but that was always going to happen. If you take away people's democracy through the European Union, then people will have no choice but to go to either the far left or the far right. In many cases, they are actually very similar. Marine Le Pen and the Front National in France, many of their economic policies are actually of the left. They're protectionist, they're Keynesian, about investment, rather than privatisation and budget reductions and tax cuts. So really, in terms of European politics, people are going to extremes because, of course, it's the only way of making their voice heard, because democracy means nothing in the European Union at the moment, because, of course, it's not a democratic institution. The EU is deliberately anti-democratic, that seeks to take away people's voices. It makes elections redundant, so people in that shouldn't have no choice but to vote for extremist parties, to try and say, we feel we are not being listened to, and our interests certainly aren't being looked after by the current elite.
So that point in Williams, that the EU is not a democratic union, does that ring true to you?
To some extent. I mean, I am not as, let's say, pessimistic about the European Union as a project as my colleague there. I think that it has a lot of potential. One of the things that during the Thatcher years, it was the European Union regulations which actually blunted much of Margaret Thatcher's assault on working people and poor people. It ensured that there was a minimum of social provision, that there was a minimum of trade union rights. And the European Court of Justice has consistently stepped in on the side of constitutional rights for Britons, which the British elite would have refused them. And some of the people who want Britain out of the European Union do so that they can take back those rights from the British people, which is what the argument is currently about the terms of leaving, whether that legislation should be dismantled. But I'd like to make the point about Jeremy Corbyn is not far left in any traditional sense. The policies that he stands for and stood on were roughly those of the Labour Party until Tony Blair came along. John Smith, the former Labour leader, Neil Kinnock ran on platforms like this. What has happened has been a wholesale shift for the parties that purported to defend working people, basically accepting this neoliberal consensus, which is to some extent epitomised in the current European Union. I mean, there were no votes in Greece or in Europe on whether people wanted to inflict those conditions on Greece, for example, or on Portugal. This was decided by technocrats. They forced governments on countries that weren't elected simply so that they would do European Union bidding. And this, in the end, means doing the bidding of the bankers. I mean, the European central bankers, especially the Germans, they looked after Goldman Sachs, they looked after Deutsche Bank, they looked after the others. And what we're seeing is finance capital is running the show. They run it financially, of course, but also they run it politically. If you look at their candidates, if you look both parties in America, apart from Bernie Sanders, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, they are packed with financial contributions from the financial sector. And now their offices, their cabinets are packed. Their advisors were packed with people there. And it's this ideological grip that the neoliberals have, that what is good for the banks is good for the people. And I would say this is an extremely dubious premise. If it's good for the banks, it almost certainly isn't good for the people. It almost certainly isn't even good for the rest of industry. Because the banks want to make money. They don't care whether people actually make things and sell them or whether they meet needs. They just want to make money. And they've done that. The last financial crisis was probably the biggest transfer of wealth since the Goths took Rome. They just looted the place. They've looted the world and taken that money. And now they're spending it to stay in power. They're financing campaigns. They finance campaign after campaign across the world to make sure that the people who come in represent their point of view. even when they pretend not to, like Donald Trump. When they come out with populist measures, in the end, they always revert to backing the banks when it comes into power.
Well, let's talk about Donald Trump, Robert Oulds, and I'd like to just get your reaction because we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the groups here in Europe. And this was one of the headlines, Europe's new fascism, ? The far-right leaders hoping to take power in 2017. Dutch politician Geert Wilders saying that Mr. Trump's victory is the beginning of a patriotic spring.
Well, really, the politics of Donald Trump aren't actually the politics of Eurosceptics within the UK. Britain wants to leave the European Union so we can have better links with countries around the world, more trade agreements, more trade access to emerging economies, to other countries around the world, because we feel the European Union actually holds Britain back. And the working classes within the UK, going back more than a century, have always been in favour of free trade. And that's been borne out in elections going back to 1906, where, of course, working class people, or those of lower middle class backgrounds, overwhelmingly voted for free trade policies. And around the UK, there would be building such as the Free Trade Hall. It's something that Britons have always believed in. We feel the European Union isn't actually good enough in terms of trade. In terms of Donald Trump and the United States, he actually follows the traditional American policies of protectionism, of favouring industry, and that's the policies of the Republican Party going back into history to the time of before even Lincoln in the United States, which is all about protecting industries within the north of the United States, not having open sort of trade policies because they wanted to protect their own markets and their own producers. That's Donald Trump's vision. In terms of American politics, people like Goldwater, the Republican from the 1960s, and of course Ronald Reagan, the president throughout most of the 1980s, he's, in a sense, they're aberrations. They wanted American economy to be open, whereas usually a lot of people in the United States actually want to seal off the borders, as it were, in terms of trade, just to protect their own industry. And Donald Trump is actually pushing those kind of policies forward, and that's one of the reasons why he won in those Democrat, or what were once Democrat states, because they feel they've been let down by Hillary Clinton and the open trade policies pursued by her husband Bill Clinton when he was president. And of course they turned to Donald Trump because, of course, so many people have lost their jobs. American industry has declined massively. What's known as the American middle class have found themselves in real terms to be less well off. Before, there would be one breadwinner. Now, of course, the husband would have to work, say, for instance, 2 jobs in many of these states, like Pennsylvania, and one, the wife having to go to work as well. And still, it's very difficult to make ends meet because the American industry has declined so much. So in desperation, people turned to Donald Trump, who, of course, had a very clear message in terms of sealing off those borders. Of course, hopefully would have a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, but that's yet to be seen. But, of course, with countries such as China, they wanted to stop the open trade access and the access to the American market so they could protect America's jobs. Whether that policy would actually work or not is another matter, but in desperation, people turn to him.
Well, let's draw some similarities here in Williams between Marie Le Pen of France's National Front. Nationalist Party, populist rhetoric is abound there. She promotes anti-immigration and anti-European Union positions, and of course protectionist economic policies. She has obviously touted the fact that Trump has become president, that it has given her so much confidence as to come out and say that she stands a real chance of becoming president, even though she didn't fare too well in the most recent polls regarding that. Is it because the governments of respective governments, for example, in Europe, have failed the people when it comes purely and simply to the economy, that they are now turning to these other parties which are termed far-right? Is that at the thrust of this argument that far-right parties are gaining popularity because they're not reaping the economic benefits that they were promised?
They have failed the people economically. But I think the other part is we've got to think of ideology in the sense of inspiration. If you look across Europe and America, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, it's very difficult to think of anybody who was inspirational, who said, we have potential, we have a future, we can do things. And we have to remember that across Western Europe, at a time when governments were, if not directly interventionist, but dirigist, where the governments took an interest in the economy, tried to protect industries and keep them alive, even not with outright protectionism, right through the 1945 to 1975 was the golden age for Western Europe and the OECD. Living standard rose, unions were strong, workers could actually afford to send their children through college without bankrupting themselves. They could buy homes. And then come 1970, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, they pulled the ladder up. There's a whole generation now that can't expect those things, whose children will have to accept a debt that would make a surf quail with the size of it, that they can never pay off if they want to go to college, if they will have any option to get out. So social mobility is blocked off, visibly so, and the leaders have nothing to offer.
Okay,
so
I got to unfortunately jump in and give 30 seconds to Robert Oulds. I do apologize, Ian Williams. Robert Oulds, in 30 seconds, tell us if you think the European Union, as a result of these far-right parties, is under threat. Many of these parties to have said that they're going to pull themselves out, whether through referendum or not.
The European Union will not survive in the long run because, of course, it's not delivering economic prosperity. It's actually harming people's futures. Countries could well be leaving the euro. Italy could be the next country that would actually exit. I don't think that France would necessarily leave the European Union, but, well, really, the European Union is being pulled apart by its own contradictions and its own failed economic policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I got to jump in. We're fresh out of time. Let me thank our guest, Senior Analyst at Foreign Policy and Focus, Ian Williams, and there you were listening to the Director of the Burgess Group, Robert Oulds, who spoke to us from London. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitagbe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, is goodbye.